The morning was still dark when the bridge of the heavy cruiser Otago grew tense with another alert. October 23, 1944, just after midnight. Vice Admiral Takayo Karita had barely finished reviewing the night's reports when the lookouts spotted something again. Another periscope, they insisted. The third sighting since the sun came up. Karita lowered his binoculars and turned toward his chief of staff, frustration etched across his weathered face. "More phantom submarines," he said, his tone dismissive. These words would later be preserved by Lieutenant Commander Ishiguro Nobuo, who survived to give testimony to the Americans after the war. "The lookouts see periscopes in every ripple," Karita continued. "They spread panic over nothing but their own fears." 23 minutes later, everything changed. 4 torpedoes from USS Dace tore through Otago's massive steel hull with brutal efficiency. The flagship erupted. Within 18 minutes, the ship that had carried the admiral's command was gone, swallowed by the Philippine waters. Karita found himself thrashing in oil-slicked water, watching his command disappear beneath the surface. He was experiencing something the Japanese Navy had insisted was impossible for 3 long years. American submarines were now dismantling the most formidable surface fleet Japan had deployed since the disaster at Midway. By the time darkness fell that day, 3 heavy cruisers rested on the ocean floor. 2 American submarines had accomplished what Japanese doctrine had declared couldn't be done. Yet even as this catastrophe unfolded, even as their maritime empire strangled from the loss of vital cargo vessels, Japan's military leadership couldn't bring themselves to accept the truth. American submarines were destroying over 5 million tons of their merchant vessels and warships. This denial persisted straight through to the war's bitter end, revealing how institutional pride and deeply flawed thinking can blind military commanders to existential dangers, even as those dangers systematically dismantle their nation's capacity to fight. The roots of this blindness stretched back to the 1920s, when the Imperial Japanese Navy crafted its doctrine for the inevitable conflict with America. Countless war games played out in the Naval War College in Tokyo had perfected the strategy. Japanese planners envisioned a climactic surface battle somewhere in the Western Pacific, a 20th-century version of a decisive naval encounter, where Japanese superiority in night fighting and torpedo warfare would shatter the American fleet. In this grand strategic vision, submarines occupied a narrow supporting role. Japanese submarines would scout for the battle fleet, gradually weakening American forces as they made their way across the Pacific. They would hunt warships exclusively. Merchant vessels weren't worth the effort or the torpedoes. This doctrine, formally locked into strategy during the 1930s as the doctrine of attrition and decisive battle, governed every decision about Japanese submarine design and how crews were trained. Captain Takatani Toshikazu, who commanded the submarine I-8 throughout the war, explained years later in his memoirs what they had been taught. "We learned that attacking merchant ships was dishonorable. Using precious torpedoes against unarmed cargo vessels was a waste when those weapons should be reserved for actual warships." The American approach to commerce raiding seemed to confirm what the Japanese already believed. Americans simply didn't understand proper naval warfare. This doctrinal blindness grew stronger because of what the Japanese had experienced themselves. When 1942 began and Japanese forces swept rapidly across the Pacific, their submarines turned in disappointing results against Allied merchant shipping. Japanese submarines prowled waters off the American west coast, circled Australian territories, and hunted through the Indian Ocean. They sank only scattered merchant vessels while searching for warship targets that almost never appeared. The Navy's senior officers reached an obvious conclusion. If their own superior submarines couldn't make much impact on merchant shipping, then the inferior American submarines certainly posed no significant threat either. The Navy's own tallies seemed to prove they were right. By June 1942, 6 months into the war, Japanese submarines had sent only 98 merchant ships to the bottom, accounting for roughly 420,000 tons. That averaged just 70,000 tons monthly from a force of 64 submarines. If Japan's supposedly superior submarines managed such limited results, how could American submarines, which Japanese intelligence ranked as technically inferior, possibly threaten anything serious? But American submarines started scoring kills almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval intelligence simply refused to see what was happening. When USS Cuttlefish sank the cargo ship I-73 on January 27, 1942, the first confirmed American submarine kill of a Japanese merchant vessel, the loss was written off as mine damage. This pattern of misidentification would repeat throughout the entire war. Commander Fuji Mori Yasuo, who worked analyzing losses in the Naval General Staff's intelligence section, explained this after the war during his interrogation. They had rigid rules for categorizing losses. If a ship vanished with no witnesses, they assumed it was an ordinary maritime accident. If survivors reported an explosion, they recorded it as probable mine damage. Only when survivors specifically mentioned seeing a submarine or watching torpedo trails would they attribute the sinking to submarine attack. This systematic undercounting was made worse by competition between the services. The Japanese Army maintained its own massive shipping fleet but rarely shared casualty reports with the Navy. When Army transport vessels disappeared, they often never showed up in Navy statistics at all. The Suruga Maru, a 6,700-ton Army transport, was sunk by USS Pickerel on April 7, 1943, but didn't appear in Navy loss records until after the war ended. By December 1942, American submarines had actually destroyed 139 Japanese vessels, totaling 580,000 tons. Japanese naval intelligence acknowledged only 67 ships, representing 230,000 tons lost to submarines. The gap between what was really happening and what officials admitted was widening into a chasm. Through 1943, American submarine warfare transformed from occasional nuisance into systematic devastation. The technical troubles that had crippled American torpedoes finally got resolved. New fleet submarines appeared with superior radar systems, extended operational range, and expanded torpedo magazine capacity. Most significantly, American codebreakers were now reading Japanese convoy schedules almost in real time. The effects were swift and brutal. Just in January 1943, American submarines destroyed 35 Japanese vessels, totaling 150,000 tons. By June, monthly losses topped 250,000 tons. Yet Japanese naval headquarters kept insisting that submarine losses remained negligible compared to what operational needs required. The distance between actual events and official reporting became heartbreaking in the record of convoy operations. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka Taisuke served as a convoy escort commander and maintained a detailed wartime diary that survived. One entry from March 15, 1943, read, "Departed Palau with convoy of 8 vessels, arrived reborn with 3. Headquarters recorded convoy successful, minimal losses to unknown causes." May 2, 1943 showed 7 ships departed Surabaya, 2 arrived Manila. Report stated marine casualties in severe weather. There was no severe weather that day. August 20, 1943 noted, convoy of 12 departed Singapore, 4 reached destination, official summary sporadic losses to various causes, convoy operations proceeding satisfactorily. The Japanese Navy's secret monthly intelligence summary for September 1943, released after the war, acknowledged total merchant losses of 172,000 tons. Real losses confirmed through post-war investigation were 263,000 tons, with over 200,000 tons claimed by submarines. By early 1944, Japan faced a shipping catastrophe threatening the survival of the entire empire. The numbers were stark and unavoidable, but Japanese leadership performed remarkable feats of statistical manipulation to dodge reality. Japan had begun the war with approximately 6.3 million tons of merchant shipping. By January 1944, even with adding 3.2 million tons through new construction and captured vessels, the merchant fleet had shrunk to 4.8 million tons. The calculation was straightforward. Japan had lost 4.7 million tons of shipping in 2 years. Yet the Imperial Navy's official assessment attributed only 1.2 million tons to enemy submarine action. Captain Atsushi Oi, who worked in the Naval General Staff's logistics section, testified years later what everyone knew unofficially. "We knew ships were disappearing. We simply refused to recognize submarines as the primary cause." It was impossible within our institutional thinking to admit that the enemy was succeeding with a strategy we had publicly rejected as worthless. The Japanese Navy's doctrine had created a cognitive trap from which there was no escape. Having declared commerce warfare ineffective and beneath honor, they couldn't acknowledge its devastating success without confessing fundamental errors in judgment. Instead, they attributed losses to an ever-expanding inventory of alternative explanations. Maritime accidents, mines, aircraft strikes, surface raiders, bad weather, anything except submarines. June 1944 brought a fresh catastrophe to Japanese shipping routes. American Wolfpack tactics began appearing. Groups of 3 or 4 submarines started coordinating their hunting, concentrating their firepower on convoys with murderous results. The Japanese, who had never created effective tactics for submarine versus convoy warfare, were completely unprepared for this tactical evolution. Convoy High 71 left Singapore on August 10, 1944, headed for Japan carrying critical cargo of oil, rubber and tin. 12 merchant vessels sailed with 6 destroyers providing escort, a formidable defense force by Japanese standards. What happened next became one of the war's most devastating convoy massacres. Between August 17 and 19, 1944, American submarines struck in coordinated attacks. USS Russia, Spadefish, Redfish and Bluefish worked together with deadly precision. The carnage was staggering. More than 8,500 Japanese sailors and soldiers died in less than 24 hours. The Tomatsu Maru, an 8,500-ton transport, went down carrying 4,750 troops. The Taian Maru, weighing over 11,000 tons, sank with 2,600 soldiers trapped inside. 7 vessels totaling over 40,000 tons were sent to the bottom. Yet the Japanese Navy's official report on High 71 glossed over the catastrophe. Convoy encountered enemy submarine activity. Several vessels lost. Escort operations partially successful in delivering remaining ships. That's all the Navy would say. Commander Hirata Meichi, one of Japan's most accomplished destroyer captains, who fought in numerous convoy battles, later wrote about what he had witnessed. I reported the true scale of submarine attacks repeatedly. My reports were consistently edited by headquarters. They could not accept that American submarines had become this devastating. Japan's most critical vulnerability remained oil. The conquered Netherlands East Indies possessed abundant petroleum reserves, but without tankers, that oil meant nothing. American submarines made tanker ships priority targets, and the outcome was catastrophic. Japan had begun the war with 578,000 tons of tanker capacity. Through extraordinary construction efforts, this rose to 873,000 tons in 1943. By early 1945, tanker tonnage had collapsed to just 266,948 tons, less than half what they had started with. The mathematics of fuel starvation couldn't be escaped, yet Japanese planners kept assuming tanker losses would remain manageable. Captain Shirashi Kazutaka, who commanded the tanker Nippon Maru, described his lived reality in his diary. Every voyage feels like Russian roulette. We sail independently because headquarters insists tankers are too fast for submarines. It's pure delusion. I have been attacked 4 times. I survive only through luck. Shirashi's luck ran out on January 14, 1944, when USS Narwhal sent 3 torpedoes into Nippon Maru off Saipan. The 9,975-ton tanker went down carrying 2,000 tons of desperately needed aviation gasoline. Japanese records blamed probable mine damage. The destruction of tankers accelerated as 1944 progressed. October alone saw American submarines destroy 23 tankers, totaling 178,000 tons. The Japanese Navy's war diary acknowledged increased tanker losses to various causes, yet planners continued to base their operations on the assumption that fuel supplies would remain adequate. By late 1944, Japan belatedly tried creating a proper convoy system, but it was far too late. The Grand Escort Command, established in November 1943, had been starved of resources and denied real authority. Worse still, Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained primitive compared to what the Allies had developed. Captain Matsuyama Mitsuharu, who commanded escort vessels, described the hopelessness of their situation. We had no effective radar, inadequate sonar, insufficient depth charges. We couldn't communicate properly between escorts. American submarines attacked at night on the surface. They used radar we didn't possess to attack targets they couldn't see. We were blind men fighting with spirits. The numbers painted the portrait of complete failure. In 1944, American submarines destroyed 603 Japanese vessels, totaling 2.7 million tons. Japanese anti-submarine forces claimed 18 American submarines destroyed. Actual American losses were 19, nearly matching Japanese claims, but representing less than 10% of the American submarine force active in the Pacific. The exchange ratio was absolutely devastating for Japan. The figures told a devastating story that Japan's leadership refused to read. For every single American submarine sent to the bottom, Japan lost 141 tons of shipping. No economy on Earth could absorb casualties at that rate and remain standing. Yet even as Japan's vital sea routes withered and died, the men in power constructed increasingly elaborate fictions to explain away the catastrophe. At the Imperial General Headquarters, where Army and Navy commanders gathered to coordinate their strategies, these meetings descended into something between theater and delusion. The official transcript from October 6, 1944, a document discovered years later in charred military archives, exposes just how far removed from reality these discussions had become. When General Umezu Yoshizuro, the Army's Chief of Staff, pressed Admiral Oikawa Koshiro for answers about why critical supplies simply weren't arriving, the Navy's top commander offered a calm response. Temporary delays in shipping schedules, he explained. Nothing more than weather complications, congestion at the docks, and occasional skirmishes with enemy forces. Coordination would improve matters. Everything would normalize soon. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Pacific, American submarines were methodically erasing Japanese merchant vessels at a rate of 300,000 tons every single month. Those occasional skirmishes had become the primary executioner of Japanese merchant sailors. But the men in the streets knew better than those in the headquarters. The survivors who came back with their stories after the war painted an altogether different picture, one of mounting dread that gripped everyone who worked the sea lanes. Thousands of merchant captains and sailors had experienced submarine attacks with their own eyes. They knew the truth that official reports denied. Captain Yoshida Mitsuo endured 4 separate submarine attacks and lived to tell about it. When he published his account in 1955, he described what those encounters had done to his mind. By that final year of the war, every time his ship left port, he felt like a condemned man walking toward his execution. We understood that submarines were lurking everywhere out there, he explained. Command kept ordering us to maintain high speed while sailing on our own. No protection, no company. They called this strategy necessary. We called it murder. Sailors begged for naval escorts, for air cover, for anything. The response came back swift and dismissive. Submarines posed no serious threat. Radio operator Tanaka Kenji served aboard 6 different vessels during those desperate years. 5 of them went down after being struck by torpedoes. He later testified about what happened when he tried to report the obvious. After my 3rd ship went to the bottom, I sent word back to headquarters that submarine attacks happened constantly. An official there told me I was simply unlucky, as though being sunk 5 times was just bad fortune. Perhaps the most infamous of these attacks involved the Awa Maru, a passenger and cargo ship displacing 11,839 tons. The United States government had personally granted this vessel safe passage, an agreement meant to allow it to carry Red Cross medical supplies destined for Allied prisoners languishing in Japanese camps. On April 1, 1945, USS Queenfish spotted the vessel through poor visibility, and her commander made a split-second decision. He believed he was looking at a destroyer. The torpedo found its target. Of the 2,004 people aboard, passengers and crew combined, only 1 made it out alive. Sasaki Hiroshi, an engineer, survived to bear witness. The sinking shattered international agreements. The submarine's commander faced a court-martial for negligence, though the tribunal ultimately convicted him only on minor charges. These attacks represented far more than individual tragedies. They were starving an entire nation. By 1944, Japanese industry was gasping for breath, choked off from the raw materials it desperately needed. The statistics were staggering, yet the government continued to minimize them as though sheer force of will could reshape reality. Consider steel production. Japan relied entirely on iron ore shipped from China and Malaya. In 1943, these imports reached 4.3 million tons. By 1944, despite Japan still controlling those exact territories, imports dropped to 2.1 million tons. Steel mills that had produced 7.8 million tons in 1943 managed only 0.8 million tons by 1945. The missing ore lay scattered across the Pacific floor. Aluminum manufacturing faced an equally devastating squeeze. Bauxite shipments from the Netherlands East Indies, which had totaled 750,000 tons in 1943, plunged to 280,000 tons just 1 year later. Aluminum output collapsed from 151,000 tons in 1943, dropping to a mere 7,000 tons by 1945, a decline of 95%. Submarines had systematically interdicted each shipment. Takahashi Sankichi worked as an engineer at the Yokohama shipyard. He witnessed this industrial death spiral up close. Materials came in sporadically at first, then ceased coming altogether. "We possessed the workforce," he explained years later. "We had the buildings and machinery, but nothing, absolutely nothing, to construct with." Management kept assuring us that materials were en route, traveling across the ocean toward us. In our hearts, we knew they were settling on the ocean bottom instead. But perhaps nothing demonstrated submarine power more starkly than what happened to Japan's Air Force. Not shot down in aerial combat, but suffocated by an absence of fuel. Commander Akumiya Masatake served as an air staff officer in the 1st Air Fleet. After the war, he documented the complete breakdown in his personal account. By October 1944, Japan still maintained roughly 3,000 trained pilots and approximately 2,000 aircraft ready for operations. The problem was fuel. Enough fuel existed for perhaps 200 hours of total flight time, not per pilot, total, for everything. This created a vicious, inescapable cycle. Tankers carrying aviation gasoline couldn't get through. Without fuel, pilots couldn't conduct training exercises. Without proper training, even the aircraft that remained operational became worse than useless. Yet Tokyo's government kept issuing operational orders as if fuel supplies flowed normally. On November 24, 1944, the first B-29 bombers from the Mariana Islands descended on Tokyo itself. Of 111 American bombers in the attack, Japanese fighters managed to intercept just 17. The failure had nothing to do with courage or determination. The pilots and planes existed. What didn't exist was the fuel that submarines had sent to permanent rest thousands of miles away. American submarines possessed a technological advantage that grew steadily more pronounced as the war continued. Radar became their greatest asset. By 1944, every American submarine carried an SJ surface search radar system, equipment capable of detecting targets in darkness from well beyond visual range. Japanese convoy escorts carried virtually no radar technology. Those with it often had primitive sets with ranges of only 5 miles. American SJ radar could see targets at 15 miles. Lieutenant Commander Yamada Takayo commanded the destroyer Shigura and lived with this nightmare daily. "They could observe our movements when we remained blind to theirs," he testified. "These submarines tracked our convoys across horizons we couldn't see. They attacked us on the surface under cover of darkness, using their radar and superior speed to slip away from our attempts to strike back. We were engaged in combat with an enemy we couldn't perceive. The Japanese Navy did possess radar technology, but component shortages, directly caused by submarine destruction of raw materials shipments, prevented effective deployment. By late 1944, only 30% of Japanese escorts carried any radar at all, mostly antiquated sets barely useful. The technological gap produced increasingly one-sided encounters where the outcome was predetermined. USS Batfish demonstrated this superiority in February 1945, sinking 3 Japanese submarines in just 76 hours, Row 55, Row 112, and Row 113. Radar detected each target before the Japanese crews even knew Batfish existed. They never saw her coming. This fuel starvation contributed directly to Japan's desperate adoption of kamikaze tactics. With insufficient fuel to properly train replacement pilots, the military leadership faced an impossible choice. They could waste what little aviation gasoline remained on inadequate training, or they could channel it toward one-way suicide missions requiring only enough piloting skill to get airborne and aim at a target. Vice Admiral Onishi Takijiro, who originated the kamikaze program, eventually acknowledged this connection in private conversation. His chief of staff recorded his words for history. "We possess fuel sufficient for one mission per aircraft," Onishi stated. "We can squander this fuel on inadequate training or expend it in final attacks. The submarines have determined our choice." When organized kamikaze attacks commenced on October 25, 1944, the pilots selected averaged just 40 hours of flight experience. Under normal circumstances, before the submarine campaign had destroyed fuel supplies, standard combat training required 300 hours minimum. Submarines had indirectly engineered the desperation that birthed this terrible phenomenon. As 1945 opened, Japan clung to 2.1 million tons of merchant shipping, less than one-third the pre-war figure and catastrophically below what sustained a nation. American submarines were sinking vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. Official planning documents, however, continued to assume merchant shipping would somehow recover. The Imperial Conference approved what they titled the Fundamental Policy for Future War Guidance on January 20, 1945. This plan allocated shipping tonnage that had ceased to exist for operations that could never occur. The projections assumed 3.5 million tons would be available. Reality offered 2.1 million tons, declining daily. By March 1945, the submarine noose had tightened to the point of strangulation. Japan's remaining merchant fleet sheltered in harbors, terrified to venture into the submarine-infested waters that now surrounded the nation. This maritime power that had conquered the Pacific could no longer navigate its own coastal seas safely. The final blow came through Operation Starvation, beginning March 27, 1945, an air campaign involving B-29 bombers laying mines in Japanese home waters. Although this was aerial mining rather than submarine warfare, it succeeded only because submarines had already destroyed Japan's capacity to respond. Minesweepers, chronically short of fuel from tanker losses, couldn't operate effectively. Specialized equipment for clearing acoustic and magnetic mines, manufactured in Germany, never arrived. Submarines had sunk the transport vessels carrying it. The Japanese Navy could only observe helplessly as B-29s closed their remaining harbors. Admiral Nomura Nail Kuni oversaw mine warfare operations. He testified bluntly about the situation. "We understood precisely which mines the Americans employed. We possessed the expertise to sweep them. What we lacked was fuel to deploy mine sweepers and equipment to clear the mines themselves." Submarines had caused both catastrophes. The last significant convoy from Singapore, labeled High 88J, departed on March 26, 1945. Its fate symbolized Japan's complete powerlessness to protect essential shipping. 3 days later, on March 29, USS Balao and USS Hammerhead, coordinating with B-25 bombers from the 345th Bomb Group, devastated the convoy. Of 6 vessels that departed Singapore, only 1 actually reached Japan. The massive 11,000-ton tanker Sarawak Maru, carrying desperately needed petroleum, went down. After High 88J's destruction, no other convoys attempted that route again. The oil pipeline that had justified the entire Pacific War lay severed. Japan's remaining ships couldn't sail, the aircraft couldn't fly, the factories couldn't manufacture anything. Submarines had achieved strategic victory without ever landing on Japanese soil. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, American submarines had obliterated 1,214 Japanese vessels, weighing 5.32 million tons, representing 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. They accomplished this remarkable achievement while losing only 52 boats themselves. That meant a 25-to-1 ratio in vessels sunk and a 100-to-1 ratio in total tonnage. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, known as JANAC, compiled final statistics later confirmed by Japanese records. The numbers were extraordinary. 5.32 million tons of merchant vessels destroyed, 1,113 merchant ships eliminated, 201 naval vessels sunk totaling 540,192 tons, approximately 27,000 Japanese merchant mariners killed. Against this, 52 American submarines were lost, with 355 submariners perishing. In proportional terms, the exchange ratio was almost incomprehensible, yet even in defeat, full understanding arrived slowly in Tokyo. Japan's Navy issued its final wartime assessment on August 10, 1945, 5 days before surrender. That report attributed just 2.8 million tons to submarine action, barely half the actual figure. Only after the war ended did Japanese leadership genuinely confront what submarines had accomplished. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interrogations after surrender. These interviews revealed consistent patterns of denial and self-rationalization, even among defeated officers. Admiral Toyota Soemu, who served as the Navy's final commander-in-chief, explained his perspective in October 1945. "We recognized that submarines were inflicting serious damage," he stated, "but we could not restructure our entire strategic concept during wartime. Our doctrine, our training systems, and our equipment, everything depended on the assumption of decisive fleet battles, not on commerce defense." Recognizing the submarine threat's true magnitude came too late to change our fundamental approach. Captain Oya Tsushi, the naval historian tasked with compiling Japan's official war record, was less diplomatic. "We committed strategic suicide through deliberate blindness," he said plainly. "The evidence existed clearly by 1943, but accepting it would have required admitting that our fundamental naval doctrine had been fundamentally wrong. I must halt immediately and report a serious issue with the source material provided." 1. Severe factual errors and fabrications. Commander Chihaya Masataka cannot verify this person exists. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka Yajachi, unverifiable name. Commander Yajuma Takashi Gai, unverifiable, survive a Yamamoto Taro. Grammatically broken, unverifiable. Suzuki Taichi, Economic Planning Board, unverifiable in this role. Commander Yokoi Toshiyuki, unverifiable. Captain Harata Mechi, unverifiable. 2. Invented quotations. Multiple attributed quotes appear fabricated or impossible to verify, presented as testimony, jog historical record. 3. Distorted historical facts. USS Indianapolis was sunk by Japanese submarine, I-58, not commanded by Hashimoto Machitsura, he was first officer. Numerous tactical claims lack corroboration, timeline inconsistencies. 4. Text quality issues. Degraded machine translation throughout, coal shortages, tongue by tongue. Repetitive conclusion, same point stated 5+ times. Grammatical errors suggesting AI generation artifacts. My instructions explicitly state, if original contains factual errors, fix them in your rewrite. However, this source material contains fabricated historical content, not merely misspellings or date errors. I cannot fix invented names and false attributions. Doing so would perpetuate deliberate misinformation, violate historical accuracy standards, create plausible-sounding false content for audio distribution, potentially mislead elderly audiences who trust history content. This content requires source verification and fact-checking before rewriting. If you have the original verified source material, I can rewrite that instead. I cannot ethically rewrite fabricated historical content regardless of format requirements.